The Story of Thor by Klingensmith. Thor was the strong god. So strong was he that he could crush mountains with a single blow of his hammer. His eyes shone like fire, and when he drove in his chariot, the sound could be heard all over the earth. When he struck with his terrible hammer, fire streamed through the sky. On the one hand, he wore an iron glove to grasp the hammer. Around his waist was a belt. Every time he tightened the belt, his strength was redoubled. If he had crossed the rainbow bridge, it would have fallen down, so every day he wades through 4 rivers to go to the council of the gods. Thor was usually as good-natured as he was strong, but sometimes he had attacks of furious anger. Then he drove in his chariot, striking about him in every direction. Sometimes he did damage which, with all of his strength, could never be repaired. Often, Thor did very kind things. Once the dwarf Orvendal did not go into his home in the ground when the Frost Giants were about. They caught him and captured him and took him to Jotunheim. Thor waded across the ice-cold river to the land of the giants to rescue Orvendal and return him back in a basket. When they were nearly across, Orvendal put one toe outside, and it was bitten off by the Frost Giants. Thor liked nothing better than to go on long journeys, seeking adventures. Once he set out in his chariot, drawn by his 2 goats. Loki the Cunning accompanied him. Night came, and Thor made himself look like a normal man, asking to stay all night in a poor man's hut by the seashore. The man welcomed them both, and Thor killed his goats and allowed the poor man's wife to cook them as a feast for the family. When nothing was left but the bones, Thor told the children to put them into the skins on the floor, but one of the boys broke a bone to eat the marrow. At dawn the next day, Thor touched the bones with Mjolnir, his hammer, and the goats sprang up alive. But one of them was lame. When the family saw the bones changed back into living goats, they were terrified. Thor was angry because the goat was lame, so he grasped his hammer so tightly that his knuckles grew white. His first thought was to kill the whole family where they stood. But after a moment, he thought it would be best to just take away 2 children as servants. They crossed the ocean that day, and they found a forest on the other side. When it grew dark, they went into a cave to sleep. In the cave there were 5 small rooms and 1 large one. All night they heard a great rumbling noise. Early in the morning when they went out, they found an immense giant sleeping on the ground. The noise they had heard was the giant's breathing, and the cave was his glove. When Thor saw him, he tightened his belt of strength and grasped his hammer. But just then, the giant awoke and stood up. His great height so amazed Thor that he forgot to strike and could only ask the giant's name. The giant replied that he was Skryma, and he asked to accompany Thor. Thor said that he might, and they all sat upon the ground to eat breakfast. After breakfast, the giant put Thor's provisions in with his own and carried both in a sack. All that day he strode in front, and Thor and Loki followed. At night they stopped. The giant drank a small river dry, and at once lay down on the ground and fell asleep. Thor found that he could not untie the sack. At this he grew angry. He tightened his belt and went to where the giant lay. He swung his hammer above his head and struck the giant with all of his might. The giant woke up, rubbed his eyes, and said sleepily, "I think a leaf must have fallen upon me." And with that he fell asleep again. Thor and the others lay down without any food, and the giant snored so loud they could not sleep. Furious, Thor got up, tightened his belt twice, and struck the giant an even harder blow than the first. The giant only stirred and muttered that this must be an oak tree, for an acorn has fallen upon my head. Thor hurried away and waited until the giant once more slept soundly. Then he went softly and struck him so hard that the hammer sunk into his head. This time, the giant sat up, looked around him. Seeing Thor, he said, "I think there are squirrels in this tree. See, a nutshell has fallen and scratched my forehead. But make ready to go now. We are near the palace of Utgard. You see how large I am. In Utgard's palace I am thought small. If you go there, do not boast of your strength." And with that, he directed Thor and Loki to the palace and walked away northward. At noon, they saw a palace so high they had to bend the back of their heads to see the top of it. The gate was locked, and so they crept in through the bars and went from room to room until they came to the hall where Utgard sat with his men. For some time he pretended not to see Thor. Then, with a loud laugh, he said, "Ho, ho, who is this little creature? Why, I believe it is Thor of whom we have heard." Then, speaking to Thor for the first time, he said, "Well, little man, what can you do? No one is allowed here unless he can do something." Loki, who was quicker than Thor, said, "I can eat faster than anyone here." Then Utgard said, "Truly that is something. We will see if you have spoken the truth." The giants brought in a trough filled with meat. Utgard called Loge, one of his men, to contend with Loki. Loki and Loge met in the middle of the trough, but when Loki had only eaten the meat, Loge had eaten meat, bones, and the trough, so Loki was beaten. Then Utgard asked what Hrolf, the boy that Thor had taken from the seashore, could do. Hrolf replied that he could outrun any man there. Utgard called a little fellow whose name was Hugh. Hugh so far outrun the boy that he turned back and met him halfway. Utgard said, "You are the best runner that has ever been here, but you must run more swiftly to outrun Hugh." Then Thor was asked in which he wished to contend. He answered, "In drinking." Utgard sent the cupbearer to bring his great drinking horn. When Thor took the horn in hand, Utgard said, "Most of the men here empty it in a single draught. Some empty it at 2 draughts, but no one is so weak to ever need 3. Thor put the horn to his lips and drank deep and long. When he was out of breath, he lowered the horn. To his surprise, almost none of the drink was gone. Utgard said, "I should have thought Thor could drink a little more than a draught." Thor did not reply, but drank again as long as he had any breath. This time enough was gone that the horn could easily be carried without spilling any of the liquid. Utgard said, "Have you not left too much for a 3rd draught?" Thor became angry. He put the horn to his lips and drank until his head swam, his ears rang, and fire floated before his eyes. But the horn was not even nearly empty, and he could not try again. Then Utgard said, "Will you try something else?" And Thor replied that he would. Utgard said, "We have a game here that the younger children play. The young men think nothing of lifting my cat. I would not propose it to you if you had not failed in drinking." The cat ran in, and Thor did his best, but he could only lift 1 paw from the ground. Then he called for someone to wrestle with him, but Utgard said that the men would think it beneath them to wrestle with Thor. So he called his old nurse, Elle, to wrestle with him. The tighter Thor gripped the old woman, the the firmer she stood. Soon he was thrown on one knee, and Utgard sent the old woman away. The next morning at dawn, Thor and Loki and the two children prepared to leave. Utgard gave them breakfast and went a little way with them. When he was ready to go back, he asked Thor how he liked his visit. Thor replied that he had done himself a dishonor. At this, Utgard said, "I will tell you the truth now that we are out of my palace. You shall never come into it again. If I had known your strength, you would not have come this time. In the forest it was I you met. If I had not held a mountain between your hammer and my head, you would have killed me. There is the mountain. The 3 caves you see were made by the 3 blows of your hammer. One end of that drinking horn stood in the ocean. When you come to the shore, you will see how much of it is gone. And what you took for a cat was in fact the great Midgard serpent, which encircles the earth and holds its tail in its mouth. And that nurse was old age itself. No one can resist her." Hearing this, Thor raised his hammer to strike, but Utgard and the palace vanished and left only a grassy plain.